Now that we are armed with the classification of Stephens's types of measurement, we can take a look at more practical aspect, at the actual response scales that we can use in our studies. We can classify those scales following Stephens's distinction between ordinal nominal interval ratio. More often people say non-metric and metric, because if you have an interval ratio scale, it doesn't even matter. You apply the same bunch of methods. And if you use an ordinal or nominal scale, you need to apply a different bunch of methods called non-parametric methods or non-metric. And we'll talk about that sooner. Scales can also be continuous or discrete. Some scales have only a fixed number of points, like from 1 to 7. Whereas in other scales, you can just move the slider to like 4.75, and that will be your exact answer. That will be essentially a continuous scale. And scales can be bipolar or unipolar. You can ask to evaluate, for example, is the president of the country kind or evil, or kind not kind, evil not evil. In the second case, you will have unipolar scale, presence, absence of a property rather than two opposite properties. And these might have also important consequences for your measurement. And finally, based on material, a scale can be graphic or numeric or verbal. Different people may be comfortable with different formats. So in clinical settings like this pain measurement scale, which is given to people in a hospital, there are both graphical, numeric, and verbal points of reference, which different people can use in order to evaluate their own level of pain. And in our studies, we use, in psychology, most often we use textual scales, like in questionnaires. But sometimes we also use purely numeric scale, like on a scale from 0 to 10, please evaluate this. And sometimes we use graphic scales. For example, in the world happiness report, which is based on Gallup's survey around the world, the Gallup's World Poll. Basically, this whole happiness report is based on a single item, the overall life satisfaction measured by Cantor's ladder. They show this ladder to people and they say, imagine that at the bottom is the worst possible life you can have, and at the top there is the best possible life you can have. Taken all things together in your life, could you please mark the step where you stand currently? And why do they use this graphic format? Because this Gallup's World Poll is conducted around the world in countries like Africa, where people cannot read. They don't know maybe numbers, many of them. So as a result, you can apply this kind of scale even to small children or to people who are not literate. And this is very useful. Discrete or continuous scales. Usually we use discrete scales because it's much easier to work with them, but also sometimes, especially with computers, you can use kind of continuous scales. The problem is that more effort is needed to accurately place yourself on a continuous scale. And when we use discrete scales, we also have a lot of choices with respect to precision. If you look at some classical questionnaires developed in the 1940s, like the MMPI, you will see that an answer is typically given in terms of a 2-point scale, yes or no, agree or disagree. Do you have nightmares? Yes or no? Well, if I have nightmares once a month, is it yes or is it a no? It might be very hard for people to make this decision. That's why this type of answer scale frustrates people a lot. And also, it is not economical because it gives us very little information about individual differences. So imagine a person has read a statement and then they just give you an answer yes or no, 0 or 1. It's one bit of information. But if you used a 4-point scale, asking them to evaluate their agreement, like disagree, mostly agree, and agree, you would get already 2 bits of information, twice as much. So you can have in your questionnaire twice as fewer items to get the same, pretty much the same precision of measurement. That's why we typically use 4 to 7-point scales in most studies. For people in mass samples, usually 5-point scale is considered the most reasonable maximum because it might be hard for some people to distinguish between more than 5 categories. But if your scale is aimed for people with higher education or for people who are comfortable with information, 7-point scale is also quite often, quite typically used. But of course, the more points on the scale, the more effort is needed to evaluate your position. And some researchers, actually some perverted researchers, they might use scales like from 0 to 10 or even 100-point scales when a person is asked to evaluate their agreement in as a percent. But these scales are actually very difficult to not only to answer but also to work with, because it's not clear that different people use this large scale in the same way. With a 100-point scale, some people can set 50 as their point of reference and go up or down, whereas other people can say, okay, maybe 0 is my point of reference and I will evaluate my agreement. As a result, you will get a lot of bias in your individual differences, and we only use these large scales when we have an option to give just one question, like in large sociological surveys. But in psychological studies, we typically use 4 to 7 point scales. Another reason to use 5 to 7 point scales is that if you have a 5, 6, or 7 point scale, even if this scale is kind of ordinal, assuming that its interval does not distort your statistics very much. Because technically, a scale like disagree, mostly agree, mostly disagree, mostly agree is of course ordinal. You can never prove that the difference between disagree and mostly disagree is the same as the difference between mostly disagree and mostly agree. But if you have 5, 6, or 7 such categories, you can kind of ignore this fact, put it under the carpet, and pretend that it's interval. At least your parametric stats will not be biased very much. In psychology, you can encounter one specific type of item, one specific type of response scale, which is called Likert item, or a Likert scale. It is a scale that looks like the one shown on this slide. It is a statement or a question, and there is a bipolar answer scale, which where all alternatives are given integer numbers and verbal labels. The response scale is presented horizontally and at equal visual intervals between scale points. This is very important if you are formatting your questionnaire in Microsoft Word. Make sure you align the columns. Otherwise, it may affect the way people answer if they complete it on paper. So all those properties are necessary to call it a Likert item or a Likert scale. If one or more properties are absent, we can call it Likert type item, or maybe a discrete visual analog scale, something like that. It's just a more general type of scales. So this was about measuring some subjective properties with questions. Of course, sometimes we use just one question to measure a construct. Like, for example, in the Gallup World Poll, they measure this well-being with just one satisfaction question. But of course, in our practice, this is often not enough. We often use composite scales that include many single questions. And in this case, this single question, we call it an item, and the whole scale we call a scale. Whereas when it's just one question, we can call it either an item or a single item scale.